arată o lume în care America nu vrea să-și mai joace rolul de superputere. Rămâne valabilă teoria conform căreia un loc rămas gol este imediat completat de altcineva, însă variantele pe care le avem nu sunt în favoarea democrațiilor. Ar mai fi și cazul în care SUA se reinventează și vine cu noi soluții pentru problemele mondiale. Discutăm despre toate aceste opțiuni cu Nicholas Kass, fost diplomat american. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport diplomatic. Nicholas Kass, former US diplomat, welcome back to Diplomatic Passport.
It's great to be with you again, Cristina. Thank you.
Nicholas, we witnessed the war in Ukraine and we see that there is a phase where the help coming from the West decreases. What will follow?
Well, I mean, I think if we step back just a little bit further, we can see this as a major strategic defeat for Western efforts to expand NATO and to impose its power in the area, out of area. As you recall, when we last spoke on your program back, I think it was in May, before the counteroffensive, I was arguing then that we should have a diplomatic solution almost immediately, as quickly as possible. And it was the case that the counteroffensive actually revealed many of the weaknesses. I mean, first of all, it was horrific in terms of its effects. It was completely disastrous, but it also revealed the weaknesses of the Ukrainian position. So I expect that now many people, particularly in America, are already turning attention to other things. They are not convinced that the money they've already spent has been spent well. It doesn't seem to be that the administration is making a strong case for this. Most of the rhetoric seems to have been focusing on the prospects of a Ukrainian invasion of NATO, which I think is absolutely ludicrous, frankly. That seems to be the talking point that American politicians and diplomats are using in order to sort of rally support, which is very disingenuous and I think counterproductive, frankly, because a lot of people will just reject that. So I think we're in a position where you might get some aid, but clearly the end is near. There is going to be more and more pressure on the part from the West, even if by omission, just by withdrawing support, to negotiate a solution. The Russians are not yet done, I don't think. They've certainly consolidated their control over the eastern provinces. I suspect that they'll probably also consider moving into Odessa. The implications there are very profound for the future of Romania, and certainly Romania as a Black Sea state. But I think that ultimately there will be some sort of resolution. As I say, we're almost at the end, but we're not quite there yet. I think the Russians still want to establish some facts on the ground. But this has been a strategic debacle of enormous proportions, coming on the heels of Afghanistan, of the pullout of Afghanistan.
Well, if we look at Russia, we see that all the budget they have is going to go towards the defense expenses. I mean, they make no cuts when it comes to defense. Right. So that means they are ready for a continuous war. Maybe it's not only Ukraine. What can be done if it's not only Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that I was most concerned about since before this war started was the idea of an out-of-area operation by NATO in an area that was not a vital NATO or U.S. national interest was going to have potential blowback, and I think we're seeing that. You know, a lot of people committed to the American course of action, and now they see that, if anything, the Russians are closer to the borders, closer to the West than they had been before. I think that the imperative right now then is to focus less on Ukraine and more on the actually existing NATO states. If you want to strengthen NATO, if you want to protect NATO, if that's the national interest, if that's the vital interest of all these countries, then the focus should be on the NATO members and not should be on some increasingly difficult to perceive effort to help Ukraine without a strategic purpose having been articulated. So from my perspective, I think that the importance in this region would be showing up ties between the United States and Romania, both commercially and economically. That would also go for Bulgaria. I would also put Greece in there. I think Turkey is managing itself quite well. But I think that the effort should be focused on the actual existing NATO members and try to repair and reassure them by wise commercial and military investments that NATO is still strong. And it would also require, I think, an increasing commitment by these countries, by the NATO countries, to defending themselves. Because if indeed we are at a place of concern, and again, I do not share the concern that Russia is going to invade NATO territory. That would be insanity. But if there is some concern here, then I think that the countries in this region, the NATO members in this region, need to pick up that responsibility. And I suspect that will probably be something that will be appreciated and followed by the United States as well.
Yes, but if Ukraine is lost and Russia will have still Putin as president for a longer period, we know he's preparing to do that. They have elections as well, and it's not real elections. Won't Russia be the same old aggressor of the region? I mean, who can guarantee us that only because we are inside NATO, they will not attack the rest of us?
I mean, I think that it's been pretty clear just by looking at what's happened over the last year and a half that Russia does not have the power projection capability into NATO. And that would be also a strategic gamble of historically epic proportions for them to move into NATO. You know, they might think of NATO as a paper tiger. I doubt they do. I think that they would think that ultimately NATO did not think that Ukraine was a vital national interest. It was something that we were trying to get and win over, and it would have been great from the NATO perspective if we could have gotten Ukraine over into the NATO camp, but that it wasn't worth fighting for. The Americans weren't going to send troops. Nobody was going to be sending troops. That was a pretty clear indication that there was a limit to how far the West would go in supporting NATO. But that doesn't mean that when it comes to the actual vital national interests of NATO that the Russians are going to completely disregard those as well. They might say, well, the Americans weren't committed to Ukraine ultimately, but in terms of treaty members, I think it's a different game strategically, and I don't think Putin is a fool. Secondly, as I say, the military capacity of Russia seems to have been demonstrated very, very well on the defensive. And again, I defer to military experts about this, but they were having trouble in the early part of the war when they were hoping, I think, to intimidate Ukraine without themselves having a clear strategy about how they would end this. When they shifted to the defensive, they became extremely formidable. But that does not mean they have offensive projection capabilities beyond where they are, beyond the Ukraine. They're going to be confronting U.S. and other air forces. It's a whole different world when you think about that. So again, I would say that despite what the administration says, the real concern is not about Russia attacking a unified NATO. The concern is how to, again, strengthen and shore up a NATO that has been confused and thrown into some sort of doubt about American leadership given the incompetence on display and the lack of strategic foresight by the United States in determining that decision.
Russia, if we look in its history, we see that they have some periods of calm and then immediately start a war. Even in 2023, we saw that they destabilized a lot of countries in Africa, for instance. They got involved in some coups attempts and successful coup d'etat. They also are very friendly with Hamas. We saw the outcome of this in the Middle East. Won't Russia start at some point something even against NATO, even though they know it's impossible for them to win?
On the one hand, if you're talking about an attack against NATO, I think we can rule that out. If we're talking about Russian efforts to destabilize or to screw around or to promote its own interests, this is time-honored great power tactics. This is something that the Russians have been doing for a very long time. It won't surprise you to know that they are not the only ones who have done this over time, right? So this is, should be expected. Again, to me, the importance and the way to combat this is not only through strategic defense spending, also through defense cooperation between the United States, say, and Romania. Let's just focus in on that way as a good example of what should be done elsewhere, but also commercially. Because it's been the case for many, many years that when the Russians try to impose their influence or to work in different places, a lot of times they'll use commercial means to promote their influence. And in my way of thinking, the best antidote to that would be to more fully integrate, say, Romania into the Western economy, to give Romania and help it develop the tools where it can take its extraordinary natural resources and marry that to a real culture of entrepreneurialism, which requires some transformation of the Romanian state, rather, because as you know, although there's been many positive changes since the previous era, sometimes the bureaucracy still operates with the mentality of the old days, although the ideology has changed, and there may not actually be any ideological motivation behind some of these actions, but the way in which the state operates continues to operate the way it has traditionally, and that is, I think, an obstacle to the kind of economic dynamism that would be the best antidote to these kind of shenanigans from the Russians.
When Russia does something, all its actions are done in the name of peace, and we see that their new best friends are Iran, first of all, and North Korea, second of all.
Right.
What kind of peace is Russia wanting?
I think from the perspective of the Russians and the perspective of all these powers, and again, I think one of the tricks is to sort of divorce yourself from your particular point of view or interest, and to look at this as rationally, as coldly as possible. That doesn't mean to not take into account emotions and how people are driven by their emotions, but if you want to understand what's going on, you have to kind of take a step back. And I think part of the problem has been that the American unipolar moment has had some negative effects on a lot of people, and it has encouraged many of these countries to make common cause. I mean, it is remarkable when you have, and I think about this in the context of Romania in particular, Romanian culture is replete with examples of how Romania survived amid empires. And, particularly when I think about the Ottomans and the Russians and, the examples of Brâncoveanu and Dumitru Cantemir and those people, I mean, it's very, very illustrative of this precise dilemma. How do we get by with these? What we knew also from that Romanian experience, if you look at that as a window, is that Russia and Turkey, say, as the Ottoman Empire, were strategic competitors for many, many years, for centuries. So the question is, how did the unipolar moment create a dynamic such that two centuries-old blood foes, like Turkey and Russia, could start to find ways to make common cause? Or if you think even more abstract, or take back another little step, how the Chinese and the Russians, despite their objectives, are working together and have now become sort of partners, strategic partners in a way that is detrimental to Western and particularly the United States interests. Well, part of this was something of our own doing. And I think that there has to be some real soul searching and thinking about how we interact with the world and how that activity that has gone on since the end of the Cold War has kind of helped generate some of these things. And it's not just in the Ukraine or with respect to China. And I'm not saying that it's all America's fault by any means. I mean, countries are countries and they have their own interests, and there's little way to control the domestic political developments that sort of shape and inform a country's approach to the world. But to the extent that you have, as America, was a superpower, global superpower, does have power and influence over the world, you have to start thinking about what your own actions are and whether or not what you are doing has had some contributory effect to this. Clearly, in the case of Russia, that's been the case. I mean, this whole idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO, which increasingly took shape over the last 15 or 16 years, was clearly a red line, and there was something that too many in the West blithely ignored, because they supported the principle, of course, that anybody should be able to come into NATO, because in the liberal international order, that's how the world should work. Well, the reality is that it doesn't quite work that way. And insisting on, you know, these sort of abstract principles sometimes that don't make sense in the context of reality lead to reactions that we can't understand because we're almost incapable of seeing the situation as it is. So I think that there has to be some soul searching, there has to be some real identification on the part of the United States about what the realities are on the ground, and then you can find opportunities to extend your own influence and find ways to actually deal with these situations. And I would say that applies directly to the Middle East situation that we're dealing with as well.
In the Middle East there is a lot of emotion because of the war between Israel and Hamas. Yeah. We saw a lot of people being killed in Gaza. Those who are still alive are forced to live in a smaller part of the land. How do you think it will end? What could be the end of this situation?
When you put this all together in the context of the failure in Afghanistan and the failed pullout, the failure in Ukraine, and now the situation in the Middle East, I think what you're looking at is a clear end of the old international system, the old rules, and the entry into a new period about uncharted territory here, as far as we're concerned. I think that basically the end of this is going to have to be a cessation of hostilities. Now we have to understand the context. Israel was attacked by vicious terrorists in Hamas, and 1,400 people or 1,200 people were killed, innocent people, right? Israel has to respond to that. There's no question that they have to respond to that. To failure to do that would be to break faith with the Israeli people. You have to defend your people and your state. The question is always, how do you do that? If you're thinking of what Hamas did intentionally to kill civilians as horrific, it's hard to look at what's happening there and not be horrified by what's going on. And what seems to be this interesting parallel between extremists in Israel and extremists in Palestine, which is to identify Hamas and the Palestinian interests as the same. Now, I know it's not an easy thing to pry those things apart, but clearly, you know, it makes it easier for some of the more radical Israelis to think of Hamas and Palestinians as inseparable, because then the tactics that you use don't have to be as discriminating. And I think there are clearly many people who have been talking about this. You had the President Herzog, who mentioned, you know, the whole nation of Palestine is responsible. You had the finance minister, Smotrich, saying basically, we voluntarily want to depopulate the people. I mean, people know what this means. And it's less important to talk about what the terminology is and or what this constitutes or that. The fact of the matter is, on the ground, this is breeding precisely the kind of horrific situation that you want to avoid. I wrote back in October that if indeed this was Israel's 9/11, that the United States then had an obligation to demonstrate and to show Israel how to avoid making the same mistakes we did. And recently, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, came out and said basically, if you fail to discriminate between the local population and the terrorists, essentially, that you are going to face a strategic defeat. He said this publicly. This is at a time when the United States we're still sending weapons like crazy to Israel, right? So we're being viewed, obviously, in the Middle East as complicit. So there has to be some recognition that this needs to stop, and there's potentially some sign that this might be the case.
When we first recorded the interview together, we were talking about the pictures behind you, because you are together with a lot of former US presidents, right. And now one of those in the pictures behind you apparently will run again. I'm referring to Donald Trump. Yeah. How will United States and the world under Donald Trump can look again?
Well, I mean, I think one of the virtues that Donald Trump presents is that he is not wedded to the American establishmentarian view and coalition of interests that props up the kinds of foreign policies that we have seen of late. The approach to Ukraine and our approach to the Middle Eastern conflict, I think, are manifestations of a mechanism foreign policy mechanism and cultural mechanism that sort of produce these kinds of outcomes without much regard to the actual facts on the ground. So I think he's much more flexible and able to think outside that box. The chances of a real political realignment that has been sort of ushered in by the very fact of President Trump's earlier candidacy and now his potential return, certainly his return to electoral politics, is going to be have a very profound influence on where America goes from now on, regardless of who wins.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de X. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!